As I was preparing for this Sunday, I was having a little difficulty, and it revolved around this title that I put together. It says, some things you can fix and some things you can't. And it didn't sound right to me, and I kept looking at it, and I forgot a part of it that should have been there. And it is, what's the point? What's the point? And the best way I know how to illustrate this is a scene from a movie called Flying in the Clouds. Came out, I guess about 2009, 2010, and it starred George Clooney. Excuse me, it's Up in the Clouds. And he was a consultant, business consultant, that flew from one company to another doing the downsizing for the CEOs that didn't want to do it themselves. And in the introduction, he says, he flies the previous year. I think he'd flown 337 days out of the year. He had been with 20 different companies, and this was the life he chose, and he liked it. And then suddenly, he met a woman, and he fell in love with her. And that's part of the movie, that the questioning, their relationship. But they had been invited to a friend's wedding. And the night before the wedding, the George Clooney character and the groom were talking, and the groom says, I was up most of last night thinking about this wedding. And I was thinking that, okay, we get married, we move in together, we buy a house, we have a kid, then we have another kid, and then there are Thanksgivings and Christmas and football games and school activities, and then they're grown. And they leave home, and they're on their own. And here I am, I'll be 70 years old, fat, bald-headed, and then I'll die. And so I came to the conclusion, what's the point? What's the point of getting married? Well, I think looking at the audience out here this morning, there are a lot of very successful marriages, and I think we probably know what makes a good marriage. But this is what the Pharisees and Jesus were talking about, particular that conversation about what's the greatest commandment. And Jesus says it's simply, love me and love your neighbor. Can anything be any simpler? But the Pharisee in his voice was saying, well, what's the point? You're a Jew. We have the laws of how we should treat each other. Our laws go back to the time of David, and then forward to the time that Moses put together the Ten Commandments, which Jewish law is based on. And it was at this time, in the first century, there was a lot going on. There were messiahs running all over the countryside, claiming, to be the Son of God. And none of them were particular very interesting people, obviously, and people didn't get too worked up about them. But this man, Jesus, came among them. He didn't have any money. He didn't have any social connections. And yet he really began to stir the population up in Israel. And as we know, at this time, the countryside there was ruled by the Romans in faraway Rome. And they were constantly worried about these people because they always seemed to be agitating about something. And the Pharisees were one of the sects of Judaism which were the keepers of the law, so to speak. And they were concerned about Jesus and what he was doing. Because he was, in a sense, or at least they viewed him as being an obstructionist. Because you had to believe, as every Jew did at the time, in the laws that were laid down in purity of touch, purity of certain foods you could eat, and that's the way people were supposed to respond. And yet Jesus came among them teaching compassion, teaching about being your brother's keeper, loving each other for what you are. And he also spent time among the poor and the outcast, as we know. And this worried the folks in Israel. And we come to this scene that was just read. And the Pharisees, I think this is along about Wednesday of the last week of his life as we were approaching the crucifixion and the resurrection. And they pose this question to him. And he answered it very quickly. And then he asked him a question. It wasn't in this particular reading, in the next couple of paragraphs. He says, "What do you think of this Messiah?" And they didn't have an answer. And he said, "Well, David talked about him, and David respects him." And they couldn't come up with an answer. And as it concludes, they never questioned him again. So what does this have to do with us today at this time in our lives? Now, I know Martin has been preaching sermons around this, and last week he did. But I'm trying to take a little bit different approach here this morning and talk about how we relate to it in today's world. Because we've got a lot of things going on around us at this point. The good news this morning, as I said, about these kids in Thailand being rescued, which is still going on. And I feel sure there were a lot of prayers over these kids. And in my opinion, the prayers were answered, or being answered, I should say. But we've got other things going on in this world. You know, looks like we're going to have a very aggressive trade war coming up with the Chinese. And that's going to affect all of us in everything from what we eat to what we wear. Most of us are wearing clothes, or some clothes, or we have them in our wardrobe that have been made in China. So this is going to affect us. And we've got other things going on. We've got a lot of unrest in this country right now. People are confused. They're upset. They're angry. And most of us don't know why we are that way, to be real honest. We just know we're uncomfortable. The weather has been very hot and very cold. We're having climatic changes in our atmosphere. We know that. Everyone knows that. Even those people in our federal government who are denying it. That's something we have to live for. But on the other hand, we've just brought back a number of kids and adults from working in New York City on a mission trip, doing good work among people who needed our help. And I've been on a number of these trips, and I'm always amazed that somewhere during these trips, somebody we're helping will turn to us and say, "What are you doing this for? You know, what's the purpose?" Well, the purpose is we're teaching our kids about taking care of ourselves and the people around us. To be truthful, our kids are somewhat isolated. I mean, they go to a great school, they graduate, they go to good colleges and universities. There are a number of them that I know and have dealt with are leading very successful lives as young adults. We've got doctors and lawyers and nonprofit executive directors, and they learn these skills here, and we taught it to them as a congregation, not only the way we act, but in the way we support them, financially and spiritually. And last year we had 400 pounds of produce taken out of our garden to feed people. And any number of things like this are going on. There's a huge article in the Globe this morning, and I didn't read the whole thing, but there is a refugee camp in, I think, northwestern Kenya. It's got something like 80,000 people. These are people from various wars, from various countries that have been upset with their governments. And this University of Southern New Hampshire that we see all on TV advertising, they're pretty much a computer-generated hands-on learning institution. They are developing programs for these people. They're living in thatched huts and so forth, and yet there's a picture of a woman that was learning communication skills for the fashion industry. And it was done by, electronically. So this is good. So all these things are going on. So what's the purpose? What's the point of what Jesus is saying? Some of us are following it, and then there are other people that could care less, one way or the other. We all know that the established church is under attack. Decreasing attendance, decreasing programs, churches are closing. We all know that. And yet there are those like us who will show up on a hot sunny Sunday morning in July listening to somebody from south of 128, as I like to say, spend a few minutes talking with you. And then we've got these wonderful music people here. They're singing a bunch of hymns from 100 years ago. And yet somebody said amen to that Ed did, that beautiful job that they're doing. So what's the point? We come together because we like each other and we love God and we approach God in so many different ways. I had a patient at hospice for over 5 years. And she died recently. She was a young lady of 32. I'd been seeing her weekly. She was originally from Puerto Rico. She lives with her family up north of here. She loved God. And yet she never was able to speak a word to me, a clear word. Earlier on, she could speak a little bit, but her disease stopped that. And we used to talk, or at least I talked to her, about God's love for her. And she talked to me through her eyes as her end came closer, and her body language. And it was a wonderful relationship. Now, as I'm putting this together, I'm thinking of her, and she lived probably longer than she should have, to be real honest. But something kept her alive. And I think it was the spirit of God's presence to her. I really do. And the love of her family. And I think this is really important to think about. We all approach God different ways. And what's the point of her staying alive? And she suffered. I know she did. We were able to control the pain, but she suffered still. But I think this is an example of a person who was very committed to her faith, whatever way it might take her, and whatever her outcome might be. And the point to her, as to all of us sitting here, is this enormous love God has for us. And in times like this, and we get up in the morning and we hear the headlines, or the TV talking to us, or the newspaper, or whatever, and it's not always good, but we can still get up, go to work, do our jobs, have fun with our families and friends, because we do know that we have God on our side. Now, there's some things we can fix and some things we can't. The things that we can fix are pretty obvious. We can send kids to New York to learn about life. We can feed people through our garden. We can help the refugees that we've taken care of and will continue to take care of. Those things we can fix. We can't fix the weather. Oh boy, I wish we could. But we can. And we'll continue to have hurricanes and thunderstorms and earthquakes and volcanoes erupting. Those things we can't fix. But we can fix how we want to live together. And that's the most important thing. Because when it comes down to it, folks, we're here. And we're here to take care of our families and our friends, provide shelter, food, whatever else our needs may be. And we can fix that. But we cannot fix everything. And it's going to have to start at this level. We can't depend on the government, and we shouldn't do some of the things for us. We have to step forward as a congregation and do these things. We're doing them now. Not saying we're not, but we're going to have to do more. You know, we're going to have to leave behind this room, this sanctuary, and go out. Because at one time, if we look at our history, the church took care of health care, they took care of our education, they took care of our needs. And that's what the church of the future is going to look like. It will not look like probably what we see today. Personally, I'll miss that if I'm around when that comes about. But to be able to do the work we need to do and to take that commandment to heart and build that church on the hill. Our forebears in this church took that first step for all of us when they got in ships and came from England because they wanted to worship their God in their own way and not be dictated by the government or anybody else. This church exists because of those people that said the point is we want to start and worship God in a new way. This church would not be here today in this form. And we, as their forebearers, are going to need to step forward and do it in ways that we can. Some of us can do more, some can do less. But we all have to work together as we move forward. So I'll leave you with this. What's the point? The point is, God loves us. This I know. Amen.